Exorcist 3. So this is William Peter Blatty's sequel, meaning the author and of the book and the screenwriter of the original film finally got control of the franchise back. He was not involved in the second movie at all. Neither was William Friedkin. Friedkin had nothing to do with this movie. But he finally got the opportunity to come back and do it right after The Exorcist 2 was an unmitigated disaster. So, yeah, the original guy back. He's doing a direct follow-up. It's based on one of his own books. Gotta be good, right? Well, this movie features weird shape-shifting, demon possession, long bouts of exposition, deranged comedy, insane overacting, and the weirdest dream sequence ever where our hero imagines dreams, foresees that heaven is basically a giant bus station filled with dwarves, Fabio, Samuel L. Jackson. Good. Now, there are great moments in this movie. I won't deny that. And it earns its cult following. It's strange enough and effective enough at times, that I can understand why some people not only support this movie, but vehemently support this movie. But those people are doing, and I'm sure I do this with certain movies too, those people are turning blinders to the parts of the movie that really don't work. So there are parts of this movie that really don't work. Blatty directed. Now, he wrote it, but he also directed. This is only the second movie he directed, and the first movie he directed was not anything special. From what I've never seen it, and from what I understand, I don't need to. It was just a very forgettable whatever thing. But he got this movie made, and it's a direct adaptation of one of his books. The book is called Legion. The book is not called Exorcist 2. Now, keep in mind, it wouldn't be called Exorcist 3, because there is no book Exorcist 2. But it's not called Exorcist anything. It's called Legion, which I believe is a biblical code. We are Legion or something. That when Jesus Christ tried to exorcise some possessed man, and that's what he said, we are Legion, implying that there were multiple demons in him. I'm not super up on scripture, but I think that's the reference. But the studio said, nah, if we're making this, we're calling it Exorcist. We're cashing in on that. But weirdly, they called it 3. They didn't just call it like Exorcist Legion subtitle. That's a fine title. Why would you ever reference part 2? Why would you just pretend that didn't happen? This is just Exorcist Legion. You don't want to remind people that part 2 was a thing. So this movie's two heroes are two characters from the first movie, both recast. Now, it's Kinderman, the cop, the guy with the glasses that always he acted like a TV cop from the 70s. I didn't like the character that much. And he's recast. I believe he was a character actor in the first movie, and I think he actually might have died between that movie's making and this one. But he wouldn't have been brought back anyway. He was not a star. He was never a star. He's replaced with George C. Scott, who was a legend of acting. I mean, the man's been in a ton of classics, best known for Patton, the movie about the World War II general. So they replaced him with a movie star. That's understandable. And then they also replaced Father Dyer. Now, Father Dyer was Father Karras's buddy. You remember, he just had a sidekick. He wasn't very important either. But he and Kinderman meet in the director's cut. Well, it's not the director's cut. The version you've never seen, you can't call it the director's cut because it's not the director's cut. It's the screenwriter's cut. But the extended version of the original Exorcist, he and Father Dyer and Lieutenant Kinderman meet at the end after kind of sadly looking down at the stairs Karras killed himself on. Or did he? And it's implied that they're going to be buddies. And they are. Like, that's what this movie is that Kinderman and Dyer are buddies. Dyer has been recast. Now, Dyer was not in the original movie played by a professional actor. He was played by a priest who was acting as a technical advisor for the film. I'm not real sure how the priest ended up getting the role, but he was good in it. I mean, for a non-professional actor, he lands that role very well. Yeah, it wasn't a super difficult or substantial part, but he did well. So, but he's replaced with a fairly well-known character actor. I'm not familiar with the man's work, but from what I understand, he had a long resume. And these are both older men too, so this is something that doesn't happen anymore. Where you have a movie where the two leads essentially are both significantly older men. I mean, these guys are both clearly 60s. Hell, they might be in their 70s, which is cool. You know, it's different. It doesn't happen. If it happens with a very specific annotation that this movie is about old people, like Red. Remember that Bruce Willis movie where it's Bruce Willis, Morgan Freeman, John Malkovich? And it's about retired feds. But anyway, or the Expendables. But so Kinnaman, I'm going to trip over these names. George C. Scott's character, he is investigating this series of ritualized, seemingly satanic murders, where people are being, young boys are being tortured to death and placed in, like, crucified in a church, that kind of thing. And the murders are shaking and they're awful, and that's so, like, it's mostly off camera and it's described in great detail because this screenplay was written by an author, so he didn't quite understand the show don't tell rule in movies, and movies are supposed to show people as much as possible rather than tell them. That's just a basic rule of filmmaking. But whatever. That doesn't bother me too much. This is a procedural cop movie. In essence, that's what this is. This is a movie about a cop trying to solve a crime, only it's a supernatural one, so he ultimately learns that the crime is supernatural and has to learn to accept that. Because keep in mind, Kinderman in the first Exorcist was very peripheral to all that. He didn't know dick about Reagan being possessed. I mean, he heard rumors and supposition, but he had no reason to believe or disbelieve that she was possessed, and presumably he tended to not believe it. So in this movie, he has to kind of find it in himself to accept it. Father Dyer kind of guides him, but really they have this grumpy old men relationship, and it's very odd. This weird, jokey conversations these two have. It's almost like a buddy movie for the first third of the film. Like, George C. Scott at one point is telling this weird-ass story about how his mother-in-law is keeping a trout in his bathtub. And he's saying it so seriously, and it's so silly. He's like, she keeps the trout in the tub. I have to leave before it wakes up. It splashes and slithers. It's scaly. It sickens me. And there's a lot of moments in this movie where like, what the hell is going on? There's one point where George C. Scott gets so upset with this guy that he like grabs, I think, his tie or maybe his scarf and like puts it over his mouth like, shut up, shut up, shut up. Are you insane? That's not something a normal person does. I mean, if you're that up... And George C. Scott's a very good actor. He is. I've seen him in several things. Not a lot. I mean, he's a bit before my time, but I've seen him in several things. He's a very good actor, but the thing about William Peter Blatty as a director, he's not reining these actors in. So the actors tend to overact in some instances, George C. Scott especially. And a normal director would just say, dial it down a peg or two. You can go big in this scene, but don't go huge. But he's just not guiding his actors like that. So, George C. Scott's character eventually, through a weirdo series of events, comes to find that there's a mental patient who looks a lot like Father Karras, Jason Miller's character from the first movie, who committed suicide at the end, jumped off a window, went downstairs. There's a mental patient that looks a lot like Father Karras, but claims to be the Gemini Killer. The Gemini Killer is a serial killer that's clearly inspired by the Zodiac Killer, the real-life killer from the 70s. But they claim to be the Gemini Killer who was executed years earlier. And he has this... They do this thing in the movie that does not work, where the Gemini Killer turns into the Silence of the Lambs. And this movie isn't a rip-off of Silence of the Lambs. They were made around the same time, so you can't really say that. But it feels a lot like that, where he spends a lot of the movie talking to the Gemini Killer. And the Gemini Killer keeps bouncing between being Jason Miller, Father Karras, who returns. Now he's significantly older, and okay, I don't know. And being Brad Dourif. Now, Brad Dourif, the very famous character actor who was on the HBO Western series Deadwood. He was Billy Bibbit, the stuttering kid in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, the voice of Chucky the Killer Doll, and the whole Child's Play franchise except for the remake. A ton of movies. And Brad Dourif is fantastic in this movie. Brad Dourif is really, in my opinion, kind of why this movie is well regarded. It's one of the best performances of his career, and part of the reason is that this character is so disturbing. The parts of this movie, like I said, the parts of the movie that work really well. And all the scenes with Brad Dourif work, except the way he keeps changing between Jason Miller and Brad Dourif. Now, they don't look that much alike. They kind of gave Brad Dourif this curly hair thing to sort of make him look a little bit more like Jason Miller, but there's 20 years, 30 years between these two guys? It doesn't work. And there's no special effect. It's just sometimes Jason Miller and sometimes Brad Dourif. Now, there's a story behind that. So apparently Brad Dourif was William Peter Blatty's choice. He cast him, and he shot the movie with Brad Dourif the whole time. And then he would occasionally say, "I'm Father Damien Karras, I believe is his name. Father Damien Karras. I'm trapped in the body of the Gemini serial killer, whatever, or the Gemini killer is trapped in my body." The movie's real loosey goosey on what the hell is going on here. This is a movie. It's not as incomprehensible as Part Two, but it's hard to make any kind of literal sense out of. But the studio saw it, and the studio didn't like William Peter Blatty's first cut. And they said, "We want Jason Miller back. We want that connection to the first movie." And so they tried, and Jason Miller was a raging alcoholic who literally could not remember his lines. And the funny thing is, this movie actually has 3 actors in it that are known alcoholics. And you gotta keep in mind that for an actor, for someone in Hollywood to be regarded as an alcoholic, they're probably drinking 3 times more than a regular person who is considered to be an alcoholic is. George C. Scott was known to have problems with alcohol. An actor named Nicole Williamson, who plays a priest at the end of the movie, was known to have problems with alcohol. And Jason Miller had serious problems with alcohol.
Inside a man.
Who are you? I am no one.
You're left with 3 actors that are known to have problems with alcohol in one movie. You got a director who has a bad relationship with the studio, who's known for being very intense and controlling on set, who's being told that he can't do what he wants. So of course he's not fun to work with, I'm sure, at this point either. You're having to do heavy reshoots, and frankly, you have a script that isn't quite working. So this movie had a lot of problems behind the scenes. As far as that goes, it came out probably better than it had any right to. And again, I get why people like this movie. Like, apparently there was a giant poll, and this was voted to have the best jump scare of all time in it. Now, I'm not sure I agree with that. I'd probably go Quarantine, the end where they put the camera up through the hole and it gets slapped by the thing. Or Wreck, which Quarantine is just a remake of Wreck, so either one. I just happened to see Quarantine first, so it got me on Quarantine. I knew it was coming on Wreck. Yeah, that would probably be my vote, but it is a very effective scene. I do remember kind of feeling like Jump. It's the scene in the hospital with the giant, they call him an autopsy device. It's supposedly used for autopsies, but it's fictional. It was made up for this. And you can tell this is a fictional device. No one would just have this thing laying around. But it's so cool looking. It's a formidable weapon. And, I actually still remember the old lady on the ceiling being kind of impressively eerie or disturbing as well. And Brad Dourif, again, his performance, he's knocking it out of the park. He plays this role with such deranged intensity. But it never becomes comical. It never seems over the top. A lot of these kinds of characters can be silly and kind of feel like they're begging for the audience to like them, maybe, or to laugh. And Brad Dourif is playing this thing deadly serious, and he is doing very, very well in this role. So with that, and the idea that essentially this is a body jump movie. It turns out that the Gemini killer is jumping from body to body, and that's how the killings are happening. And the killings, as described, are really disturbing. You don't see much of them, but what happens is harsh, and it's cool. It works. The effects are fine. Again, the plot is kind of hard to follow. The tone is all over the place. The acting is generally pretty okay with some issues. But then you get to the third act. And the third act's where this movie kind of goes off the rails, and it's because it's not the third act of the movie. It's what the studio insisted. Now, this was a movie called Exorcist 3 that didn't have an exorcism in it, and someone at the studio level said, "Hey, that's not going to make sense to an audience." So they insisted on an exorcism kind of being tacked onto the end to it, which is basically where the Nicole Williamson character comes in. Nicole Williamson, I really only know him from 2 things: Excalibur, the early 80s King Arthur movie that was actually directed by the director of Exorcist 2. It's considered to be a great movie, though. I was kind of lukewarm on it. And Spawn, that live-action version of the Spawn comic books that came out in the mid-90s that catches so much hell. I personally didn't think it was that bad, but most people call that one of the worst comic adaptations. I disagree, but whatever. But he was in that. He was Cagliostro, Spawn's mentor, basically his Yoda. And so he comes in, and they try to exorcise Karras. you know, the funny thing is that with or without the exorcism, the movie ends the same way. Now, I actually saw a fan cut of this movie, which is basically the same as the movie that we got, only it cuts the exorcism out. And that version of the movie, the ending does feel abrupt. So I'm not sure how that would have worked. Maybe, maybe it would have worked better. I honestly don't know. But ultimately, I understand this movie's following. I just don't. This is a cult movie. This isn't a genuine classic. This is maybe a cult classic, but even that's a bit generous because it doesn't feel like that many people even remember this movie was made. I honestly think you hear more about Exorcist 2 just because it's such a legendary failure. This flick, it didn't do well. It underperformed, and it basically killed the brand for another 10 years, just like Exorcist 2 basically killed the brand for a little over 10 years. And Blatty didn't really do much more in Hollywood. It was a come and go. This is definitely a movie that's going to play better on repeat viewings, and it's going to play better on a small screen because you can kind of zone out during the bad parts. A theatrical viewing of this movie, which I've had because I saw the fan edit, which is just the whole movie with the exorcism from the end cut off. You get laughs at parts of the movie that you're clearly not supposed to get laughs at. Your attention drifts. It's a very flawed movie, but it has great parts. So again, this is the good Exorcist sequel. This is the one that people actually kind of sort of respect, and it's still not that good. So that gives you a bit of a scale on how these movies go, that this is the better option from these movies. It is an interesting cult movie, but it's not a great movie by any stretch of the imagination. I think the average viewer that was watching this would probably agree with me.